Before I deal with the main point of the video, I do want to bring up yet again the constant quip that people sometimes have about generalizations. It seems that every time I get a new generation of Thinking Ape subscribers who have not been with me for a long time, they protest my arguments and my ideas because I am generalizing. Have I generalized in the past? All the time. Did I generalize in my last video? Yes. What's the problem here? Well, their argument, as it goes, so often you hear, is that generalizations don't apply to everyone. No fucking shit, Sherlock. We all know that generalizations do not apply to everyone. This is not news. However, if you refrain from generalizing, you are left with absolutely nothing to say about anything or anyone. That is to say, if you want to describe a phenomenon, a behavioral phenomenon that represents a general trend of an animal, a species, or a sex, you are left to say nothing because it's a generalization and it doesn't apply to everyone. So if you want to talk about squirrels and how they like harvesting acorns and climbing up trees, you might then cite, but I knew a squirrel that didn't do that. In fact, it spent most of its time on the ground, even though it was a classical North American gray squirrel. So don't talk about squirrels, you're generalizing, etc. The point here is simply to point out that we need to generalize in order to understand general trends in the behavior of animals, including the human animal. It's simply not possible to qualify every statement you make with generally speaking, and in most cases, and even in those cases, when I do say that, people ignore it and say I'm generalizing anyway. So, if you want to talk about anything, you have to generalize. If you want to talk about anything human or animal related, you have to generalize. And of course, there will be exceptions. If we talk about men and women, then we know, well, if we have a brain at least, that not every statement made applies to each and every woman or man. Things exist on a distribution curve. So, for example, it is true that tall people earn more money than short people on average. But then comes some genius out of the crowd and says, but I know a short person that earned more money than a tall person. Knockdown argument of the century. Correct? No. Because things exist on a distribution curve. What applies to the general populace or the general sum total of the people we're talking about doesn't necessarily apply to each individual, and that's implicit in the nature of generalization. So, get with the program or leave. If you don't want to talk about anything for the rest of your life because you're afraid of generalizing, and in particular, if you don't want to talk about anything related to human beings or animals, just, stay silent, don't do anything, don't say anything, and leave it at that. Don't talk about men, don't talk about women, because you're generalizing. Of course, this is not an argument, and I fear that this will not be the last time I have addressed this, but there you go. I apologize to my old-time subscribers. We've heard this bullshit often enough. Yes, generalizations don't apply to everyone. Everyone with a brain knows this. They describe general trends in behavior and characteristics. Okay, moving on, and happily moving on. Now, in light of my previous video on ejection theory, ejection button theory, if you will, or switch, I received a rather well-thought-out comment. It was not the conventional, but you're generalizing. And I'm going to read it out, and I'm going to address it in detail, because there's something to what he's saying, but I don't think it's well explained, and we need to go into greater depth on this. The gentleman writes, "Hey Stardust, I agree with a lot of things you say in your videos, but I want to challenge you on something here, mostly because I can't shake this sense that the reasoning here is generalized somewhere." Okay, a little bit of generalization there. For example, I know that the majority of people's prime intention and motivation is this transaction, sex, x material resources. It's practically written into their unconscious. Anyone can observe this in the superficiality of the dating world. However, do you think it's still possible for a person in their prime reason to connect with someone else on a personal level? Of course, I'm not excluding the possibility of someone doing both, human connection plus sex and her looks, human connection plus financial support, and not just one or the other, human connection plus nothing else. That would be absurd. But I wonder if one can still be motivated by the content of a relationship firsthand and then transaction. Because you talk about this transaction as if it is the one and only unconscious factor which overrules all other motivations. And this is where I feel the reason becomes generalized. Now hit me with your logic. Well, this is a good question if you want to consider it a question. And no doubt there are almost certainly other factors involved in forming relationships. However, Barbaros and I have talked about the bottom line. The bottom line in the male-female human relationship is this transaction of sex for resources. But we can spend time now talking about other factors. We can talk about deeper connection. Now, to do this, to facilitate this discussion, I'm going to tell you a personal story from my own life that's going to illustrate this point exceptionally well, I think. Many moons ago, when I lived and worked in South Korea, I met a girl that I was working with at the time, and we hit it off almost instantly. She was attracted to me, I was attracted to her. She was highly intelligent. We had excellent conversations about history, civilization, biology, medicine. She also had a morbid fascination with diseases I never understood, but there you have it. And the sex was quite good as well, so it just kind of worked for the most part. And we had what one might call a relationship, or shit, depending on how you want to term it. And I thought we had this excellent connection, and I think we did. And to this day, I believe we had a very deep connection, and I believe she believed that as well. A little over a year later, I found out that she was, in fact, engaged the whole time, that her fiancé was abroad. And all this time, I was unaware of this. Now, as time went by and I found out about this, we talked about it. And despite her loving me, despite all these deep connections we had, and I think we did have a rather profound connection. We got along really well. We had some similar interests, in particular similar intellectual interests, and the sex was really good. She told me one day when we discussed this issue that she was just not at a point in time in her life where she could worry about the future. She didn't want to be in a position to worry about the future. At the time, she was 29, I was 30, and this illustrates very well the point I'm going to make after I tell this story. Now, this other guy, the fiancé, was essentially a boring Midwestern farmhand of low intellect and minimal mental capacity. However, he had seemingly dreamt of becoming a provider workhorse and inseminating some woman with his semen so he could procreate. That is to say, he was dreaming the dream. And he was reliable, and he worked hard. Of course, she and he had very little in common, intellectually or otherwise, and my impression, of course, was that the sex between her and me, at least at the time, was a lot better. But despite a deep connection, despite caring about each other, she made the pragmatic decision to eject me and go for the provider workhorse. And funnily enough, years later, the contact continued. This contact went on even after she decided to leave me for the provider workhorse with whom she had been engaged the whole time, over email. And she still proclaimed her love for me and blah, blah, blah. And this is illustrative of the fact that we did have a deep connection and that we got along, at least on some level, really well, and that there was some area of conflict, or some, I wouldn't say it's a conflict, but there was a bit of conflict, at least, in her decision-making to ultimately choose the provider workhorse over me. Now, it became clear to her over time that I was an unruly sort. That is to say, I always did what I wanted to do, and while I've never been an asshole or a bad boy, I just always done what I wanted to do. She wanted to hang out, I wanted to play games, and I told her we'll hang out another time. She asked me to join her gym. I said I'm content with my gym, and so I stuck with my gym. She wanted to do this. Oftentimes I said I didn't, and I just do my own thing. So she realized that an itinerant bum who did what he wanted, who had no desire to become a father and certainly no desire to become a husband, probably, despite this very deep connection that we shared and the strong attraction and the very good sex, probably wouldn't make the best long-term partner. So she did what virtually any other woman would do. She took the pragmatic decision to move on and to partner with the Midwestern farmhand who his entire life apparently sought to become a provider workhorse. This was his dream, and it is the dream of many a man. It's a mystery to me, but there you have it. This is what I'm talking about. Of course, you can have a deep, profound connection with a female. You can share similar interests. You can have, very occasionally at least, in some cases, excellent conversations. You can have fantastic intimacy. You can have great sex. However, this pragmatic aspect of sex for resources, or rather you being the male and your desire and willingness to provide resources, will almost always override this other factor of the deep connection. Now, the gentleman does mention the combination of connection. In fact, he actually says that just deep connection would never be enough. And my story is very much demonstrative of this and illustrative of this. We had a deep connection. It existed for years after the fact. After we split up, she kept in contact. Even when she was pregnant, she was telling me she still loved me, and this was years later. Since then, I think she's popped out 2 female offspring, and she's probably looks like a hideous troglodyte by now because she's almost my age, and, well, you know. But still, the moral of the story is women will push the eject button when the pragmatic aspect isn't there. Now, of course, you could argue further and say, well, what if you had acquiesced to her? What if you hadn't been the unruly, itinerant bum that you are and gotten married and shacked up with her? We all know what happens then. The stories, anecdotal as they are countless, of the girl who used to like playing Xbox or FIFA or whatever, and all of a sudden it just stops. You get married, the sex stops. She has a kid, she's not interested in you anymore. All you are is a tool to her to fulfill her needs and the needs of raising her offspring. So I would suggest that even that route would have been a very, very bad one, certainly for me. This is what I mean by the bottom line. The bottom line in the male-female human relationship will always come down to that. Now, there is a probationary period, if you will. I would call this the early mid-20s. As the woman moves closer and closer to hitting the wall, these concerns and worries that she has about the biological clock, about procreating, become paramount. For example, I think if I had met this girl 5-6 years earlier, she probably would have stayed with me, at least for a while. We almost certainly would not have gotten married. I wouldn't have had children with her, unless she forced me, of course, using conventional means. But I think the age made a big difference. I was 30 at the time, she was 29, and she was getting very, very close to hitting the wall. And since then, of course, she's procreated, but still. When you're younger, these things are less of an issue. When you're younger, of course, you tend to focus more on a connection. Sometimes the connection is just sexual, but in this case, she and I had a similar connection in terms of our intellectual interests, certainly the physical aspects, and generally our view of the world was quite similar. But she told me, matter-of-factly, that she was just not at a point in time when she could worry about her future. She took the pragmatic decision. And, retrospectively, I don't really have a problem with that. She did what the human female does, despite her feelings. And I think, as I said, she did have feelings for me. They were legitimate, and they were ongoing for years after the fact. Eventually it dissipated, because as we know, nothing human survives the ravages of time. But I wanted to tell this story because it's so illustrative and so descriptive of what I've been talking about, this bottom line. Yes, of course, in the most superficial of circumstances, such as the sugar babies, sugar daddies, it's all about the money. There's no connection, but you cannot simply just have a connection. And if you're unwilling to comply with a female's wishes and settle down and become a provider workhorse and basically obey her and become her servant, the likelihood that you're going to have a functional relationship that is beyond, say, the mid-20s and into the 30s becomes ever, ever, ever smaller. So what am I trying to get at here? I'm trying to get at the fact that, yes, you can have deep connections with women. You can share common interests. You can occasionally, through miracles, have interesting conversations with them, and you can have amazing sex with them. But if you are not going to comply when the biological clock starts ticking, if you're not going to comply when the wall issue arises, you will encounter problems, and I'm almost certain she's going to push the ejection button on you. Frankly speaking, men such as myself are of no interest to women. At the time I had money, now I don't, but even, let's say I did have money now. What woman, and I'm rapidly approaching 40, let's say I were to meet some early 30-something, late 20-something. This is a woman who is exactly that stage. I tell her what I do, I tell her the things I enjoy, that would be a turn-off, and then I also tell her I have no interest in being married and almost no interest in having children. This is simply not appealing. We could have the most amazing connection, We could share dozens of common interests. We could have amazing sex and all of these things. But at the end of the day, that pragmatic aspect of things would override and overrule the other aspects, the connection. I mean, I look at the connection I used to have with this woman years ago, and who knows how she gets along with her husband. The husband doesn't even know that we essentially had an affair. He'll probably die without that knowledge, whatever. The guy and this woman had very, very little in common. The only thing they had in common is that they both wanted to procreate, essentially. And he was convenient, and he was obedient, and, the kind of guy who reacts to, oh, please take out the trash, honey, do this, do that, and he just nods his head and wags his tail, or in this case, perhaps his tongue. She was willing to make that kind of decision in order to accommodate her biological reproductive needs. And so, in the long run, because women face different reproductive pressures and a much smaller window of opportunity, this is why we have this. This is why we have this. You got to put a ring on the finger. You got to pay the bills. You got to do this. I mean, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it's almost certain that very few women in their late 20s or early 30s would be cool with just hanging out, having a good time, having sex, having conversations, eating, playing video games, or whatever. Because almost universally, and of course there will be exceptions, generally speaking, blah, 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 women feel that pressure to reproduce. And in order to reproduce, they need to find a mate who is willing to provide resources. I'm certainly not. I live for myself. I don't live for other people. I'm not going to live for a woman, and I never have, not in that sense. I still care. At the time, my feelings for her were lingering as well after a while. But, the reality is pragmatism. Women are extremely pragmatic, and they have to be, because I'm not faulting them for it. It's just the way they are. They have to reproduce, and they have to have that man who's willing to partner with them and provide resources and give those resources to her and her offspring, after which he becomes a mere utility, and, well, we know the rest. But that wasn't something I was willing to become, ever. And she realized that, I think, and probably months into the relationship she realized that and had already made the decision, at least in the back of her mind, unbeknownst to me. Sure, at the time it was hurtful, but I understand her reasoning. It makes perfect sense. If I were a woman in a similar position, I'd probably do the same thing, almost certainly. But I'm not. Men and women are different. I mean, on the other hand, another reason why I don't think that men have this ejection button is because we just have a much longer window of opportunity. I mean, if I really wanted to, and I don't, I could work my ass off, make money, and then, at 50-something, procreate, so I can have some genetic legacy, then this thing that everyone's obsessed about, genetic legacy. Pretty meaningless in a 13.7 billion-year-old universe, but could do that. Probably attract some 30-something wench and reproduce. Whatever. The window of opportunity is much greater for men. And thus we're much less inclined to press the eject button under such circumstances. I mean, we know the way men are. We know the way we are, right? If we can find a girl that we have a good connection with, that we can have conversation with, that we can fuck well with, that shares some of their interests, we've kind of hit a gold mine, essentially. The problem is that kind of thing is enough for a man, but it's almost never enough for a woman. Remember the formula. Men look for genetic fitness, and anything on top of that is just an add-on, a bonus. Women look for the combination of genetic fitness and the willingness for resource provision. So you can just have a resource provider like the Midwestern farmhand, or you can, I'm not saying I was particularly fit, genetically fit, but you can have someone who just you have more in common with, a deep connection. But without that combination, you're not going to get either. And I should also point out that even in the cases where there is a quote-unquote deep connection along with the willingness to be a provider workhorse, that sometimes or very often just sort of teeters out. The reality is these common interests tend to be sublimated and indeed suppressed in a marriage because the all-encompassing desire to reproduce and then have a child, all that devotion and attention goes to the child. The husband becomes obsolete. He's just a tool, a means to the end. So this is the way it is. And I'm not going to complain about it, but of course, yes, you can have a deep connection with a female. You can have powerful feelings, and she can have powerful feelings for you. But if you're not willing to fulfill that role as a resource provider, that is the pragmatic aspect, it doesn't matter how powerful her feelings are, and it doesn't matter how powerful her desire for you is, because she has to make a pragmatic decision. At the very latest, probably sometime in her mid-30s, because she's going to hit the wall, biological clock, blah, 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 blah. Men aren't troubled by this. Not at all. As I said, I would have been content to have continued a relationship at the time. We got along for the most part. Common interests, sex was good, all that stuff. It was a pretty good relationship at the time. But I would have continued on my terms. I wouldn't have fucking supplicated her. I wouldn't have gotten married and had children. But she just wasn't at a point in time to worry about her future. At the very best, I could have been a sperm donor and the guy could have been cuckolded. Who knows? But that didn't happen, thankfully. So the lesson to be learned here is, yes, there is a bottom line in relationships between men and women, and that bottom line eventually, certainly by the late 20s and absolutely certainly past 30, is going to be that pragmatic issue. I've had some fascinating encounters with women since moving to Germany in the last couple of years, where a couple of years ago when I was still working that warehouse job, for example, they speak to me, I sound articulate, I sound educated, because I am, and then they ask me what I do with a smile on their face, and I tell them, I lug around heavy shit in a warehouse. And then their facial expression warps and changes, and they just think, okay, and then a couple of minutes later they just leave and don't talk to me anymore. So this is how it works. I think Paul Prodi has put it really, really well. He has this amazing talent for imitation. The parrot imitation. So what do you do? I think that's how he did it. I'm not as good as he is, but so what do you do? Meaning, how much money do you have? What do you make? Those are just the rules of engagement. Certainly at my age, I've yet to encounter a female who just wants to have a cool conversation and hang out. I mean, I have a friend in the States who's always talking about this. He's basically 40 now, and I don't want a kid. I don't want to get married. I just want a cool chick I can hang out with and fuck sometimes. Keep dreaming and keep looking if you want that at that age. I mean, I guess you could hire an escort, but the nature of the male-female relationship, there is a bottom line. And these pragmatic aspects will always be primary and absolute compared to the other ones, at least once you reach that certain age. I mean, if you're 22, 23, yeah, you're not that worried as a female. You still have time. As time marches on, though, it becomes a primary concern, right? And there's no way around that. I don't fault women for that. I don't hate women for that. They're just doing what they're doing because that's in their best reproductive interest, I don't doubt that some women have the capacity for very deep feelings towards men, but that capacity is something that can be switched off if need be, and if not switched off, it can certainly be overridden. In my case, in my situation with this ex-wife of mine, that, yeah, there were some pretty profound feelings, but they weren't as important as her getting on and procreating, So I think that more or less covers the issue, and I've addressed the issue extensively. You can combine things, of course, but the transaction, that financial transaction, the willingness to give her stuff and the willingness to give her resources and money and support her offspring, that is going to be, at the end of the day, much, much more important than any deep connection you have, whether sexually, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, intellectually, or whatever, or a combination of all of the above. Who cares? Business and the bottom line. As Barbarossa once said, the bottom line is money, cold hard cash, resources. Are you willing to give it to her and have a kid with her? Sure. Then she'll keep you on, and watch as the relationship warps, and watch as it mutates, and you become a slave to her will. And when you don't, when you're disobedient, she will punish you. And if you're too disobedient, eventually she'll punish you by divorce and take everything you have. Kind of a lose-lose situation for a man. Especially if you're really desperate to procreate and have a so-called genetic legacy, which I'm not. I think I've said all I can on that subject. I just wanted to illustrate the point and then describe the phenomenon. if people have a problem with this, don't get angry at me. I've seen lots of angry comments in the comment section. Oh, but you're generalizing. To the people who think I'm generalizing about this, wake up and open your eyes. This is reality. Take off the blinders. This is not a generalization. 99.9% of women are like this. You reach a certain point and they have to prioritize. It doesn't matter how much he loved you or it loves you or what the connection is and how amazing the sex is. She might try to hang on to you for a while, but eventually, if you're not willing to provide for her and give her stuff, money, resources, jewelry, whatever, to show you're willing to provide resources for the brat she squirts out, it's over. Game over. Now, if you're willing to live with that and do that, that's fine. But we do not need to live in a state of denial about this and pretend that it's not the case. To pretend that they're no Walt's running around. That's not the way women operate. It is just not the way they operate. And I don't fault them for it. I don't hate them for it. Personally, I have no interest in dealing with them for that reason, because it's just, what profit do I have from it? But that's just the way they are. We need to get with the program. And if you're still dwelling in la-la land because you're afraid to generalize and you're still yearning for some love of your life, then you have a very, very long way to go, son. A very long way. That's all I got to say about that. For now, more videos to come, as usual, assuming I'm alive and Zeus favors me. You take care and enjoy your day. And I really hope it's not as hot where you are as it is where I am, because I fucking hate it. Bye-bye.